As the bell tolls for what could possibly be the very last time in a Dark Souls game, we inch ever closer to the official release of Dark Souls 3. Most fans of the series before now would have probably gone back and played the previous installments of this series in anticipation for this momentous occasion, but what of the new players? If you're just jumping into the Dark Souls series now, let me try and help you with this and ease you in as best I can. This video will be covering most of the things and most of the big plot points in the lore and in the series so far that you'll need to know, or rather should know, going into Dark Souls 3. So, before we get too ahead of ourselves with the latest installment, let's hit the rewind button and take ourselves back to 2011 for the release of the first Dark Souls. For those new to the Dark Souls universe and games, make sure you pay close attention to the opening cinematics. Whilst Dark Souls 2's opening cinematic may not have had as many answers as Dark Souls 1, you still need to pay attention to the details in the very start of the game to get what you're jumping into. In a sense, these opening cinematics are the best way to get your foot in the door for the Dark Souls universe. But anyway, let's get on with taking this refresher course that most of us probably need before Dark Souls 3. In the beginning, there was the Age of Ancients. Grey crags and arch trees scattered the land, and ancient stone dragons flew across the skies. But of course, nothing stays as it is forever. Soon there was a flicker, a warmth that would grow into being the first flame of this new world. This flame bore the souls of lords, but into this new world, it also birthed the light, the dark, and along with them, disparity. Because no matter how great the cause, one cannot exist without the other. And out of this endless conflict of light and dark arose the Dark Soul. 4 beings then arose to ascertain the souls of lords within the flame. Gravelord Nito, first of the dead. The Witch of Izalith and her Daughters of Chaos. Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight and his faithful Silver Knights. And finally, the furtive pygmy, keeper of the Dark Soul, so easily forgotten. The 4 lords then proceeded to decimate the stone dragons with all the power they could muster, and proceeded to claim the land as their own. During this onslaught, there was one named Seath the Scaleless, who sought to betray his own kind, a betrayal born from jealousy, since the pale drake Seath could not bear scales on his body like his own brethren could, and thus he was cast out by his own kind. And so, the Age of Ancients whittled away, and the first Age of Fire began to flourish. It's unknown how the first flame was harnessed, but as we see at the end of Dark Souls, it is contained within the first bonfire in the kiln of the first flame. The most common theory surrounding Gwyn and the first flame is that he linked humanity itself to the first flame, and thus created the curse of undeath, the dark sign that appears on all undead, and the never-ending cycle of light and dark. And you're probably wondering, if you're new to the series, how this cycle works. When the first flame starts to fade, the world plummets into an age of dark, until a new hero arises, the chosen undead, who relights the first flame, sacrificing themselves to prolong that age of fire, which is exactly what Gwyn himself ended up doing. However, that's all just surface level knowledge about Dark Souls. We're gonna go a bit deeper here quickly and do some rapid fire sort of stuff so you guys can get a bit more in depth with Dark Souls without having to go back and play 120 hours of both Dark Souls 1 and 2, although I urge you to go play them because they are well worth the time. So let's just answer some quick questions you may have about Dark Souls going into Dark Souls 3. What is/what happened to the Dark Soul? Now, the Dark Soul is a unique Lord Soul that was found within the first flame along with the other Lord Souls, and the furtive pygmy was the one who claimed it. As the legend goes, in Dark Souls anyway, the furtive pygmy supposedly was buried with the Dark Soul. There are many theories about what happened after that, some to do with Manus, Father of the Abyss, and others, but I'll let you find those out in your own time. But this does lead us to our next question. What is the Abyss? The Abyss came spewing forth when Manus was dug up from his grave. This is where the theory of the furtive pygmy comes into play, because some people believe that the furtive pygmy's grave was uncovered by the people of Ulasil, and in this rage, he transformed using the Dark Soul into Manus, Father of the Abyss, and therefore covered the land of Ulasil in darkness, and basically the Abyss is like the anti-light. Next question's a bit of a big one. What is a hollow? There are a lot of theories surrounding this as well, but the most widely respected one is that a hollow is the true state of man. The true state of man and the true state of humanity. To be undead is to be human, and that is the curse. So the actual curse in this case, or rather in this theory, is that humanity itself, being human, is the real curse. That was a man-made curse, or a Lord-created curse by Gwyn himself when he first linked the first flame. And this was, as we will get to in Dark Souls 2, the first sin. Then you might be asking, but how does one become undead/hollow? So being human, part of the human race in Dark Souls, intrinsically means that you are already undead. However, given the name undead, you first need to die in the world of Dark Souls to be considered an undead. So some people that don't have the mark, the dark sign, it just means they haven't died yet in that world. What is known about becoming undead/hollow is that when the fire starts to fade, the curse of undeath will start to ravage the land. And while the fire is still alight, and it's still within the age of fire, the curse of undeath should not be in play. But once the fire starts to fade, all bets are off, and the curse of undeath will once again run rampant. The difference between being undead and hollow is that hollows have no sense of self. So those hollows are people that have lost all of their souls, they've died over and over and over again until they have become just a shell, a mindless shell that really has no place in this world aside from being a soulless husk. So yeah, these games can get pretty depressing. 2 more questions and then we'll get on with Dark Souls 2. What happened to the other Lord Souls? So Gwyn was given 1, the Witch of Izalith was given 1, Nito was given 1, and the Furtive Pygmy was given 1, being the Dark Soul. So what happened to the other 3? Gwyn has the most long-winded answer. Gwyn split his soul into multiple parts. A part for himself, parts for the 4 kings who were in charge of New Londo at the time, which was a kingdom within Lordran, and then he gave one last fragment to Seath the Scaleless. Mainly because Seath helped the other lords and Gwyn defeat the ancient dragons in the Age of the Ancients. Gwyn then used the remainder of his fragment to kindle the first flame once again to prolong his Age of Fire. He then went hollow in the process of relighting the first flame. Nito, in the time that we play anyway, is still very much alive, or well, dead and kicking. And he still retains his Lord's soul as he governs over the Grave Lord Covenant in the catacombs below Firelink Shrine. And finally, the Witch of Izalith. So the Witch of Izalith basically succumbed to her own hubris in assuming that she was more powerful than she thought. She basically tried to create or recreate the first flame when it started to fade into the Age of Dark, because this is how she felt she could best achieve a new Age of Fire, rather than just relighting the first flame that was already fading. But no, she failed very badly, and in doing this, she created something called the Flame of Chaos instead, thus creating something called Chaos Demons that are scattered all throughout Dark Souls. The Flame of Chaos then caused the Witch of Izalith to turn into a Chaos Demon herself, along with her daughters and her son. And as a new player, your final question might in fact be this: who the hell is this guy and why is he such a big deal? So for starters, this is Knight Artorias, the Abyss Walker. Why is he called the Abyss Walker? Well, because he was the only one to ever walk the Abyss. The Abyss is not a physical plane of existence really, it's more ephemeral and you need magic to be able to exist there without dying. Artorias was 1 out of 4 of Gwyn's most loyal knights. Artorias himself took up the charge to hold back the Abyss, and this would have been a completely solo endeavor if it weren't for his companion, Sif the Grey Wolf. And although, while Artorias did try his best to take down the Abyss, or rather hold it back, and defeat Manus at the center, the Abyss did in fact make him succumb. When we find him in the game, he is a shell of his former self and no longer has any recollection of who he is. He attacks the player rabidly out of rage, similar to Guts in Berserker armor from the manga Berserk, which is a direct inspiration for this character. If you take a look at the game art for the Prepare to Die edition of the game and compare it with the art from Berserk of Guts Against the Full Moon, you'll see that the inspiration was definitely quite lifted off the page. And just to finish up, I'm going to quickly explain what your job is in Dark Souls 1. You are the chosen undead, sent on a pilgrimage, and you are to relight the first flame since the Age of Fire is now fading. This is a similar ploy all across the Dark Souls games, and I'm guessing it'll be in Dark Souls 3 as well in some format. But anyway, that just about does it for Dark Souls 1, and I don't want to make this video too excruciatingly long, so let's get on with Dark Souls 2. Perhaps you skip. So, basically this whole intro just acts as a welcome to Dark Souls 2, did you know you were gonna die?
You will lose everything. Your past, your future, your very light.
So, Dark Souls 2 is different in this respect because you're not a chosen undead going on a pilgrimage. You are just another random undead of the masses who is trying to find a cure for this ailment that is the Curse of Undeath. Dark Souls 1 was about prolonging the Age of Fire, not trying to find a cure or anything. Dark Souls 2 is about trying to find that cure. However, we find out it's not so simple.
Long ago, in a walled-off land far to the north.
This introduction to Dark Souls 2 is a bit shit compared to the first one, in my opinion. Just because it doesn't give you nearly enough information on this new world as Dark Souls 1 did with Lordran. This is Drang Lake Castle to be specific. Dark Souls 2 is all about how kingdoms rise and fall and the new replaces the old. And even though this place is desolate, and when we play Dark Souls 2 we're already in the ruins of the kingdom of Drang Lake. Drang Lake was built on top of Lordran, and it's this new land that flourishes from the old, although its time for flourishing is long since gone. Just as Lordran's is when we play Dark Souls 1, it always seems as if we play in the ruins of the kingdom that came before. So what's happening right now is that our player character is starting this journey to find this cure for the Curse of Undeath. The place they are in right now is theorized to be the future, and they are in part of the ruins of Drang Lake, presumably the Shrine of Amana because of the bright bugs we see here. Bright bugs are an item found in Dark Souls 2, and they are scattered all throughout the Shrine of Amana, and they're also purchased. And when you purchase them and read the description, it says they come from the shrine. So, just from logical conclusion, we can probably guess that this is the Shrine of Amana in ruins. And as we see in this opening cinematic, the player is told by that old lady, the hag, who is actually a firekeeper, and I'm guessing the last of the firekeepers, that he needs to travel to Drang Lake in order to find this cure for the Curse of Undeath. Now, that is what he is setting out to do. And this portal is most likely something to do with the Abyss, because in Dark Souls 1 there is a similar case in the DLC where the player uses the Abyss, or rather Manus pulls the player through a portal using the Abyss back in time to Ulasil, and this seems very similar to that occurrence. And as a new player, if you're wondering if Dark Souls 2 has a lot to do with Dark Souls 1, honestly, it's its own story that sets its own path. And apparently Dark Souls 3 isn't taking all that much from it, but there will be parts of the story from Dark Souls 2, or at least elements from it, that will carry over to Dark Souls 3. But don't expect Dark Souls 2 to heavily impact on 3. If anything, expect Dark Souls 1 to be more of a trendsetter for how Dark Souls 3's story and world will be put together. There is quite a bit more to talk about with this second installment though, so let's get into it.
Beyond the scope of light, beyond the reach of dark, what could possibly await?
We'll get to talking about this guy in just a second.
And yet we seek it, insatiate. Such is our fate.
Okay, so this is my problem with Dark Souls 2. None of the trailers really put you in the driver's seat for what to expect in this game. There's no story-driven elements in really any of the trailers except for the opening scene. So I guess I'm just going to have to do my best to explain without too many visual cues. The story of Dark Souls 2 begins with one man, a king named Vendrick. King Vendrick had a brother named Aldir, and together they seeked to break the curse of undeath that was ravaging their kingdom. Aldia was a great scholar, the king's best in fact, and probably smarter than anyone in the land of Drang Lake. King Vendrick tasked him with doing one thing, although maybe impossible, finding a way to break the curse of undeath. So Aldia took to his keep and tried every means imaginable to find a way to break the curse, but in the end, none seemed to pay off. So Aldia turned his experiments on himself in a final attempt to break the curse. To part with the affliction of the curse of undeath, Aldia discarded his own human form and became the monster that we see now. In earlier days than this, Vendrick had started to become suspicious of Aldia's sinister motivations. Aldia would abduct innocent, afflicted undead and torture them within his keep, along with a multitude of other monsters and creatures from around Drang Lake as well. And because of this, Vendrick saw no other means than to lock Aldia away in his own keep for the safety of himself and the land at large. And I'm guessing this is when Aldia decided to go down the path of no return. However, this is only half of the story. Even in the trailers, they don't give any inkling as to what any of these things might be, other than possibly the Scholar of the First Sin trailers, as I've played previous to these ones you're seeing now. The gameplay of Dark Souls 2 was seemingly oversaturated in their marketing strategies, and I don't think enough of the story elements were marketed well in these trailers, which could attribute to how people reference the fact that Dark Souls seemingly has no story, open quotes, end quotes. So just like we did with Dark Souls 1, we're going to get into a bit of the nitty gritty, have like a fast money round, even though it's kind of not that fast, and we will get into some finer details that can help you understand the Dark Souls 2 elements you may see in Dark Souls 3. So for starters, as a new player, you're probably thinking, how the hell does this at all tie in with Dark Souls 1? It's not even the same lord or the same king, so how does it have a continuation of story? Now, Dark Souls 2 isn't so much as about the continuation of Dark Souls 1's story, more as about the continuation of the world, and how the world evolves through this cycle of light and dark. What we see in Dark Souls 2 are the ruins of Drang Lake, and under that are the ruins of Lordran, presumably. And this evolution is what happens per cycle. Every 1,000 years or so, well, the flow of time is convoluted in Lordran, as you'll probably hear people say when talking about the timeline of the Dark Souls series, but it's argued that Drang Lake is built on top of Lordran. It's referenced many times throughout the game, although it is never exactly stated outright that Lordran is the previous name of the kingdom that Drang Lake was built on, although Strait of Oliphis says that Drang Lake is not the name of the kingdom that he remembers, and Strait of Oliphis is basically someone that was frozen, or rather petrified, for many years, and he has awoken to this new kingdom, and it is not at all what he remembers. So that is how it is connected. The world carries on, most of the characters do not. However, there are cameos and references to the previous game. If you've never played Dark Souls 2, this next topic hopefully answers some questions you may have. None of the trailers give any inch towards what it could be, and you really have to get really far in the game to eventually find out what the hell is going on within it. So, what is the main conflict, or the conflicts rather, character-wise, story-wise, world-wise, of Dark Souls 2? Your main conflict is that you are trying to find a way to break your own curse of undeath, but it is seemingly impossible. No one is known to have done it up until you find the DLC and you find a way to basically halt the spread of the curse for yourself, but no one else. And that is basically the resolution of that conflict, but then we have another conflict within the story itself, with the Abyss, with the Darkness, with Nashandra. Nashandra is basically... well, here we go. To sum this up as fast as I can, when Manus, Father of the Abyss, is defeated in Dark Souls 1, as I said, there are connections to Dark Souls 1, however not completely direct, he's shattered into fragments of darkness, and these pieces of darkness took shape in the form of his daughters. And those daughters have come back to Drang Lake, or rather have reformed in Drang Lake to try and acquire this kingdom for themselves. And this conflict spans not only the main game, but also the DLC. So how is this resolved? Basically, you end up killing them just like you do Manus in Dark Souls 1. However, this is not the most important part of this Daughters of Darkness arc within Dark Souls 2, and the next question will answer why. What is Vendrick's part in all of this? Possibly the most important question in the entire game. Vendrick is the integral key to the glue of this entire story. So to get this rolling, From the Dark Souls 1 part, we know that to prolong the Age of Fire, you must rekindle the bonfire and sacrifice yourself into the flames, and this will extend the Age of Fire for that period of time. What happened was that Vendrick chose not to relight the fire, but instead, he and his brother tried to research a way to break the cycle once and for all, so there would be no Age of Light, or Age of Fire, or Age of Dark. There would just be the world. And Aldir does speak about this in his final monologue of the game as well, which I'll just play right here.
Beyond the scope of light, beyond the reach of dark? And what could possibly await?
From this, we can assume that there must be something beyond the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark/Man. And this story element is probably something that will be carried over into Dark Souls 3 as well, and will most likely have some sort of conclusion in that installment. But then, guess who Vendrick is married to? Guess who his queen is? His queen is Nashandra, the first reformed piece of Dark from Manus, the first daughter of Manus that reformed in Drang Lake, essentially. And after some time of Nashandra being his queen, Vendrick discovers that she is in fact not who she says she is. And I'm guessing how he discovered this was that Nashandra was poisoning his mind actively. And one of the big mysteries of Dark Souls 2 when it was first released was, what did Vendrick steal from the Giants? Basically, in Dark Souls 2, one of the big other conflicts is that Vendrick has a war with giants from across the sea because Vendrick stole something very dear to them. And what he stole ends up being the giants themselves. Yeah, big mind bomb moment when everyone figured that out. Nashandra was the one to push Vendrick into this war with the giants, probably hoping to get him killed so she could usurp the throne of Want, and essentially the first flame itself, and create an Age of Darkness, without really having ever to lift a finger. So to stop Nashandra from actively pursuing the throne, Vendrick sealed it behind a King's Gate. And a King's Gate is basically a gate in Dark Souls 2 that can only be opened with a certain ring. Vendrick took that key with him, basically to his death, and then put his number one in charge of his army in front of that key to stop anyone trying to get past that King's Gate to the throne. And whilst Velstat did his job and stayed by his king for the entire time, eventually the darkness of the crypt seeped in and changed his miracles to hexes, thus creating a more dark presence within Velstat than light. Similar to Artorias in Dark Souls 1, that is how history kind of repeats itself through these games. There's a lot of parallels, actually. But the main thing I'm trying to get at here is that Vendrick set up many roadblocks in Nashandra's way to stop her from getting to the throne and creating this Age of Dark that he's been trying to stop. That's why he didn't take the throne, because he knew that once he took the throne, he would have to sacrifice himself, and therefore he would not be able to stop it from happening again. The cycle would just repeat, and he wouldn't have this chance to try and break it. By the end of Dark Souls 2, most of Vendrick's work becomes undone, because us, as the player, being puppeteered by Nashandra into removing those roadblocks from her path, our actions solely allow her to try and take the throne in the end. And so we have to deal with this problem, and at the end of that conflict, we ourselves have to make a choice. Take the throne, or leave it as it is and see what happens. Just see what happens. If the world changes, if the world goes to shit, so be it. If not, then, you know, we done good. And finally, we have arrived at what will be Dark Souls 3, the ending to this trilogy. And that will do us for this video. I hope it was at least helpful in some way, guys, and I can't wait for Dark Souls 3. So, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.